On September 1, 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, touching off a chain of events that would lead to the greatest conflict in human history. In just over 6 years, World War I would claim the lives of some 60 million people. It would also see the fall of fascism and the rise of the United States and the Soviet Union as world superpowers. The war began in Europe, but quickly spread to other continents as more and more countries were drawn into the conflict. The fighting would rage on for 6 long years until finally, on September 2, 1945, Japan formally surrendered, marking the end of World War II. The devastation of the Great War, as World War I was known at the time, had greatly destabilized Europe, and in many respects, World War II grew out of issues left unresolved by that earlier conflict. In June 1914, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary by a Serbian nationalist ignited a complex series of events that quickly escalated into war. By its end, nearly 10 million soldiers and 7 million civilians had died, making it one of the deadliest wars in human history. In the aftermath of World War I, the victorious Allies formed the League of Nations in an attempt to avoid another such global conflict. The Treaty of Versailles that ended the war placed heavy punitive restrictions on Germany, including substantial war reparations, a blue water navy, and the loss of territory. These measures, coupled with lingering resentment over the loss of life and property during the conflict, contributed to the rise of Adolf Hitler and his Nazi Party in the early 1920s. Under Hitler's leadership, Nazi Germany embarked on a program of territorial expansion that culminated in the 1939 invasion of Poland. France and Britain, who had guaranteed Polish independence, declared war on Germany, but Hitler's forces proved too much for them to handle. In 1940, Hitler defeated France and then turned his attention to the Soviet Union. The massive German army swept through Eastern Europe, but was finally stopped at the Battle of Stalingrad in early 1943. From there, the tide of the war began to turn against the Nazis. In June 1944, Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy, France, beginning a massive campaign that would eventually liberate Western Europe from Nazi control. At the same time, Soviet forces were pressing in from the east, and in 1945, they took control of Berlin, the German capital. Hitler, realizing that all was lost, committed suicide in April of that year, and the war in Europe came to an end. The war in the Pacific, however, raged on. The United States, which had remained neutral up to this point, entered the war after the bombing of Pearl Harbor by Japan in December 1941. American forces, working together with those of Australia, New Zealand, and others, fought their way across the Pacific island by island, until they finally reached Japan itself. In August 1945, the United States dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and within days, Japan had agreed to an unconditional surrender. World War II was over. While the fighting of World War II may have come to an end in 1945, the world would never be the same. The Holocaust, in which Nazi Germany killed 6 million Jews and millions of others, including Roma, homosexuals, and people with disabilities, is the best known of the many atrocities that took place during the war. The use of atomic weapons, the first time in human history that such weapons had been used, also left a deep and lasting impression. Perhaps most importantly, war is an ugly thing. It's full of death and pain, and sometimes it's hard to understand why people fight. That's why it's important to learn about the reasons behind World War II, one of the deadliest conflicts in history. There were many factors that led to the outbreak of war in 1939, but the two most important were the rise of Adolf Hitler and the policies of the Nazi Party in Germany and the appeasement policy pursued by Britain and France. Adolf Hitler was a power-hungry dictator who wanted to expand the German Reich to encompass all of Europe. To do this, he needed to build up the German military and defeat the countries that stood in his way. He also believed that the German people were superior to all others and that they deserved to rule the world. The policies of the Nazi Party were aggressive and expansionist, and they led to a series of crises in Europe in the 1930s. The most important of these was the annexation of Austria in 1938, which led to the outbreak of war in 1939. The appeasement policy pursued by Britain and France was another important factor in the outbreak of war. This policy, which was supposed to prevent war, actually made it more likely by allowing Hitler to believe that he could get away with aggression. So, these are some of the key reasons behind the outbreak of World War II. It's a complex and tragic story, but it's one that we must never forget. The Second World War came to an end in September 1945, shortly after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The main combatants were the Allied powers, led by the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom, against the Axis powers, led by Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Japan. The war had begun in 1939 with the German invasion of Poland, which triggered a declaration of war by the United Kingdom and France. The war then took a global turn when the Soviet Union invaded Finland and Hitler invaded France, leading to an Allied counteroffensive that drove the Germans all the way back to Berlin. In the east, the Japanese had begun a war of expansion in 1931, leading to a conflict with China. This conflict escalated in 1937 with the Japanese bombing of Shanghai and the invasion of China proper. The war in Europe ended with the unconditional surrender of Germany in May 1945. The war in the Pacific continued, however, with the Allies slowly pushing back the Japanese forces. The turning point came with the Battle of the Philippine Sea, after which the Japanese Navy was no longer a threat. The Allies then began a series of island-hopping campaigns, leading to the invasion of Okinawa. The dropping of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki finally led to the surrender of Japan in September 1945. In conclusion, it can be said that World War II was a turning point in history, not just for Europe, but for the entire world. The war led to the fall of the Nazi regime and the end of the Holocaust. It also resulted in the rise of the Soviet Union as a major power, as well as the US. The war also resulted in the development of nuclear weapons, which would later be used in the Cold War. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe our channel 2 Minutes.